Carl Jung's final warning to empaths was terrifying. They're feeding on your light, and most of you don't even realize it's happening. In his private notes, Jung documented a psychological phenomenon so disturbing that he hesitated to publish it. He observed that empaths, people with extraordinary emotional sensitivity, were being systematically drained by what I call unconscious energy parasites. These weren't obvious predators. They were often charming, wounded people who seemed to desperately need healing. But Jung discovered something chilling. They had unconsciously learned to survive by feeding on the spiritual energy of others, particularly empaths, whose light burned brightest. The most terrifying part? The feeding process is invisible. It happens through emotional manipulation disguised as connection, through trauma bonds mistaken for deep love, through the empath's own compassionate nature being weaponized against them. Jung realized that empaths weren't just attracting difficult people by coincidence. They were being actively hunted by those whose inner light had been extinguished and who could only survive by consuming the light of others. Join me as we descend into the shadow realm of human psychology to expose these invisible predators, learn to recognize their feeding mechanisms before they strike, and discover Jung's forbidden method for transforming from prey into sovereign, without losing the gift that makes you extraordinary. Because here's what Jung discovered that modern psychology still refuses to acknowledge. Empaths aren't born broken. They're forged in childhood trauma to become perfect hosts for emotional parasites. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." But he discovered something darker in his clinical work. When an empath meets an energy parasite, only one person gets transformed, and it's never the parasite. Think about it from an evolutionary perspective. Empaths develop their supernatural sensitivity as a survival mechanism. The child who could read every micro-expression, anticipate every mood shift, and absorb every unspoken emotion was the child who survived chaotic households. But here's the tragic irony. That same survival mechanism that saved you as a child now makes you a beacon for adult predators who've learned to weaponize your gift against you. Dr. Judith Orloff's research confirms what Jung observed. Empaths' mirror neurons fire more intensely than average people. Your brain literally absorbs the emotions of others as if they were your own. But what Jung realized, and what most therapists miss, is that some people have learned to exploit this neurological difference. They don't just accidentally trigger your empathy, they strategically activate it. They've unconsciously mastered the art of emotional manipulation that feels like connection, trauma bonding that masquerades as deep love, and energy extraction that you mistake for intimacy. But that's not the most devastating part. If you've ever felt completely drained after being with certain people, but couldn't explain why, write this in the comments. They were feeding on my light. The most devastating part is what Jung called the shadow projection reversal. The energy parasite doesn't just take your light, they convince you that giving it away is your purpose. Jung observed this pattern repeatedly in his practice. He wrote, "Everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But in the case of empaths and energy parasites, the dynamic is reversed. The parasite projects their emptiness onto the empath, convincing them that feeling drained is normal, that exhaustion equals love, that depletion means devotion. Think about the last time you felt completely drained after being with someone. Your body probably gave you clear signals: sudden fatigue, emotional overwhelm, physical tension, or brain fog. But instead of listening to these warnings, you probably told yourself you were being too sensitive or overthinking things. This is exactly what the energy parasite needs you to believe. Jung called this what I observe as the gaslight of the unconscious, when someone's shadow convinces your consciousness that your intuition is the problem. Here's how the feeding process actually works, And this is where Jung's observations become terrifying in their precision. Stage 1. The light recognition. Energy parasites are unconsciously drawn to empaths like moths to flame. They can sense your emotional availability from across a room. Jung noted that narcissistic personalities have an uncanny ability to identify empaths immediately. They recognize the glow of someone who gives more than they take, who feels deeply, who carries emotional responsibility for others. Stage 2. The wound display. The parasite doesn't approach with demands. They approach with pain. They share their trauma, their struggles, their deep emotions. They mirror your depth while hiding their emptiness. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But energy parasites have learned to become who you need them to be." Stage 3. The empathy activation. Once they've hooked your compassion, they begin the systematic extraction. They create crisis after crisis that requires your emotional labor. They trauma dump without reciprocation. They make you feel special for understanding them when others couldn't. Jung observed that empaths mistake being needed for being loved. Stage 4. The depletion normalization. This is the most insidious stage. The parasite convinces you that feeling drained is proof of how deep your connection is, that exhaustion equals love, that your emotional overwhelm means you're a highly sensitive person rather than someone being systematically depleted. But here's where Jung's understanding becomes revolutionary. He didn't see this as just interpersonal dysfunction. He recognized it as an archetypal pattern, what I call the wounded healer meets the shadow devourer. Jung wrote, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely. For empaths, this means accepting that your compassion can be weaponized, that your gift can become your prison, that your light can be consumed if you don't learn to protect it." In Jungian psychology, every archetype has its shadow. The empath's shadow isn't cruelty, it's the unconscious need to be needed. The addiction to fixing others because being useful feels safer than being seen. The terror of abandonment so deep that you'll accept emotional vampirism rather than risk being alone. Energy parasites aren't evil people consciously plotting your destruction. They're unconscious beings driven by what Jung called the shadow's hunger for wholeness. They sense in you what they've exiled in themselves, the capacity for genuine feeling, authentic connection, and emotional depth. But instead of doing the inner work to reclaim these qualities, they've learned to steal them from others. They feed on your emotional energy because they've cut themselves off from their own. They bask in your light because they've extinguished their inner flame. This creates what I call the psychological vampire effect. The more energy you give them, the more they need. The more you try to heal them, the more wounded they become. The more light you share, the darker their shadow grows. This isn't because they're inherently evil. It's because they're psychologically incomplete. They've disowned their capacity for genuine emotion, so they must constantly consume it from external sources. Like a person with no digestive system who must keep eating but can never feel satisfied. Now you're facing what I call the empath's impossible choice. You can feel their pain, their emptiness, their desperate need for the light you carry. Your compassionate nature wants to help, to heal, to save them from their darkness. But Jung discovered something that changes everything. You cannot heal someone by letting them feed on your essence. You cannot love someone back to wholeness by allowing them to drain your light. You cannot save someone who is unconsciously committed to staying lost. Let me show you what this pattern looks like in different scenarios. The romantic energy vampire. Sarah met David at a spiritual retreat. He seemed deep, sensitive, wounded in a way that called to her healing nature. He shared his childhood trauma, his struggles with depression, his search for meaning. Sarah felt chosen, special for being the one person who truly understood him. But within months, Sarah noticed she was always exhausted after their conversations. David would call during her work hours with emotional crises. He would trauma dump for hours without asking about her day. When she tried to share her own struggles, he would either minimize them or make them about his pain. When Sarah applied Jung's principles, she realized David wasn't seeking healing, he was seeking supply. Her empathy had become his drug, her emotional labor, his crutch. When she began setting boundaries, David's mask slipped. He accused her of being cold, uncaring, not the person he thought she was. The truth? Sarah had stopped being his emotional feeding source, so David's unconscious began searching for a new host. The family energy parasite. Michael's mother had always been emotionally intense. She would call him with crisis after crisis, making him feel responsible for her well-being. If he didn't answer immediately, she would guilt him about abandoning her. She would threaten suicide when he tried to create boundaries. Jung would have recognized this as the devouring mother archetype, the parent who unconsciously feeds on their child's life force rather than nurturing it. Michael's empathy had been weaponized against him since childhood. When Michael learned about energy parasitism, he realized his exhaustion wasn't about being a bad son. It was about being systematically drained by someone who had never learned to regulate her own emotions. Setting boundaries with his mother felt like betrayal, but it was actually self-preservation. The workplace emotional vampire Lisa worked with a colleague who was always in crisis. This person would monopolize team meetings with personal drama, seek Lisa out for lengthy support sessions, and make their inability to function everyone else's emergency. What made this particularly insidious was that this colleague framed their behavior as sensitivity and depth. They positioned themselves as the emotional one in a cold corporate environment. Lisa's natural empathy made her feel obligated to provide endless emotional labor. Jung would have seen this as projection. The colleague was unconsciously making their emotional dysregulation everyone else's responsibility, while positioning themselves as the victim of an unfeeling world. But here's where Jung's warning becomes urgent. The longer you allow energy parasites to feed on your light, the more you begin to merge with their shadow. You start to believe their projection that you exist to serve others' emotional needs. Jung wrote, "One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious." For empaths, this means recognizing that your compulsion to heal others often comes from your own unhealed wounds. The shadow side of empathy is the unconscious belief that you don't matter unless you're useful, that love must be earned through service, that your value lies in your ability to absorb and process other people's pain. This belief system makes you the perfect host for energy parasites. You provide endless emotional labor while convincing yourself it's love. You deplete your own resources while telling yourself it's compassion. You sacrifice your well-being while believing it's spiritual growth. But Jung discovered something that will change how you see yourself forever. Your light isn't meant to be consumed by others. It's meant to illuminate your own path toward wholeness. When you constantly give your energy away, you're not being loving. You're avoiding the terrifying work of learning to love yourself. When you focus obsessively on healing others, you're often running from the frightening task of healing your own wounds. The energy parasite becomes your enabler in spiritual bypassing. They give you someone to save so you don't have to save yourself. They provide endless drama so you don't have to face your own shadows. They offer you the role of martyr so you don't have to claim the role of sovereign. Here's Jung's framework for protecting your light without hardening your heart. I call it the light method. L. Learn to discern energy signatures. Jung emphasized the importance of what he called feeling-toned complexes. Every person carries an energetic signature that your empathic abilities can read if you know what to look for. Energy parasites feel different in your system than healthy people. With parasites, you feel drained, anxious, confused, or emotionally hijacked after interaction. With healthy people, you feel energized, clear, peaceful, or inspired. Start documenting how you feel before, during, and after interactions with different people. Your body is a sophisticated radar system that can detect energy parasites if you learn to trust its signals. Integrate your shadow. Jung believed that shadow integration was essential for psychological health. For empaths, this means owning the parts of yourself that want to be needed, that fear abandonment, that believe love must be earned through service. Ask yourself, what do I get out of being needed by broken people? How does rescuing others help me avoid my own healing? What childhood wound am I trying to heal through others? The goal isn't to eliminate these tendencies, but to make them conscious so they don't unconsciously drive your relationship choices. Guard your sacred energy. Jung wrote, "Your vision becomes clear when you look into your heart. Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." Protecting your energy isn't selfish, it's spiritual responsibility. This means saying no to emotional labor that depletes you. It means refusing to carry other people's unprocessed emotions. It means choosing relationships that nourish rather than drain you. Your energy is finite and sacred. Every moment you spend processing someone else's shadow is a moment you can't spend growing your own light. Honor. Your authentic nature. Energy parasites are attracted to empaths who dim their light to make others comfortable. The more you hide your gifts, deny your intuition, or minimize your sensitivity, the more you become a target for those who want to consume what you're suppressing. Jung believed in what he called individuation, becoming who you truly are rather than who others need you to be. For empaths, this means owning your sensitivity as strength, trusting your intuition as wisdom, and using your gifts consciously rather than unconsciously. Transform trauma into wisdom. Jung said, "The most terrifying thing is to accept oneself completely." This includes accepting that you've been targeted by energy parasites not because you're weak, but because you carry something precious that unconscious people want to consume. Your empathic abilities developed as a survival mechanism. Now they must evolve into a conscious choice. You can feel others' emotions without absorbing them. You can offer compassion without sacrificing yourself. You can help others without depleting your own resources. When you apply Jung's principles to relationships, everything changes. You stop attracting energy parasites and start drawing in conscious beings who can match your emotional depth without depleting your resources. But here's what Jung warned about during this transition. Energy parasites will escalate their feeding behaviors when they sense you're becoming unavailable as a source. They'll create bigger crises. They'll threaten suicide. They'll accuse you of being cold, selfish, or not the person they thought you were. They'll try to guilt you back into the feeding dynamic by reminding you of their pain, their trauma, their need for your support. Jung called this what I call the extinction burst of the shadow. When parasites can no longer feed easily, they become more desperate and more manipulative. This is actually a sign that your boundaries are working, but it feels like evidence that you're being cruel. Stay strong during this phase. Remember that their escalation is about their addiction to your energy, not about your value as a person. You're not responsible for managing their emotions when they can no longer use you as an emotional dumping ground. The healthy people in your life will respect your boundaries and even celebrate your growth. They'll understand when you need space, support your healing journey, and reciprocate the emotional energy you invest in the relationship. But here's the most important part. You must become the kind of person you want to attract. If you want conscious relationships, you must become conscious yourself. If you want reciprocal connections, you must learn to receive as well as give. If you want authentic love, you must show up authentically rather than performing the role others want you to play. Jung understood that this battle for your light is fundamentally spiritual. He wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." But energy parasites have a vested interest in keeping you small, depleted, and unconscious of your true power. When you begin to protect your energy and set boundaries, you're not just changing relationship dynamics, you're engaging in what I call the war for your soul. This isn't metaphorical. Your essence, your light, your life force is literally at stake. Energy parasites will use every weapon in their arsenal to maintain access to your light. Guilt. After everything I've shared with you, you're going to abandon me? Shame. I thought you were more compassionate than this. Fear. You're being selfish, and you'll end up alone. False urgency. I need you right now more than ever. Identity attacks. This isn't who you really are. But Jung gave us the ultimate weapon against these tactics: consciousness. When you can see the manipulation for what it is, it loses its power over you. The truth is, every time you say no to energy vampirism, you're saying yes to your own evolution. Every boundary you set is a vote for your authentic self. Every time you refuse to dim your light for someone else's comfort, you're choosing spiritual growth over spiritual stagnation. This doesn't mean you become cold or uncaring. It means you become discerning. You learn the difference between genuine compassion and codependent caretaking. You discover how to help others without hurting yourself. But here's what Jung discovered that will change everything. When an empath awakens to their true power, they become dangerous to systems built on unconsciousness. An empath who can no longer be manipulated, drained, or controlled threatens every relationship dynamic built on inequality. You become a mirror that reflects others' unconsciousness back to them. You become a boundary that forces others to take responsibility for their own emotional states. The awakened empath doesn't just protect their own light. They become a beacon that shows others how to kindle their own inner flame. You stop being a source to be consumed and become a catalyst for others' growth. But this transformation requires something that terrifies most empaths. You must be willing to be disliked by unconscious people. You must be willing to lose relationships that were built on your depletion. You must be willing to stand alone rather than sacrifice yourself for false connection. Jung wrote, "The meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed." When you become an awakened empath, you can only maintain relationships with people who are committed to their own growth. Everyone else will fall away. This isn't failure, it's discernment. This isn't loss, it's liberation. This isn't loneliness, it's sovereignty. Comment below if you've been called selfish for setting boundaries with energy vampires. My energy is sacred. You'll discover that you'd rather have one authentic connection than a dozen draining relationships. You'll realize that quality of presence matters more than quantity of people. You'll understand that your light is too sacred to be consumed by those who refuse to do their own inner work. There are 3 levels of empath development that Jung identified, and understanding where you are will help you progress toward true energetic sovereignty. Level 1, the unconscious empath. You feel everything but understand nothing. You absorb others' emotions without realizing it. You're constantly drained but blame yourself for being too sensitive. You attract energy parasites because you haven't learned to protect your gifts. At this level, your empathy controls you rather than you controlling it. You're like a radio that picks up every frequency but can't tune into specific stations. The solution is developing emotional boundaries and learning to distinguish between your feelings and others' feelings. Level 2, the conscious empath. You recognize your empathic abilities and begin to use them intentionally. You can feel others' emotions, but you don't automatically absorb them. You've learned basic energy protection techniques and can maintain some boundaries with energy parasites. At this level, you're beginning to see the difference between empathy and codependency. You can offer compassion without depleting yourself, but you still struggle with guilt when setting boundaries and sometimes slip back into old patterns. Level 3, the sovereign empath. You've integrated your shadow and own your empathic gifts as spiritual abilities rather than emotional burdens. You can feel deeply without losing yourself. You attract conscious people who reciprocate your emotional investment. At this level, your empathy becomes a tool for discernment rather than a trap for manipulation. You can sense others' authentic emotions versus their performed emotions. You can offer healing presence without taking on others' wounds as your own. The journey from level 1 to level 3 requires what I call the courage to disappoint. You must be willing to disappoint energy parasites who want unlimited access to your light. You must be willing to disappoint family members who've grown comfortable using you as their emotional regulator. You must be willing to disappoint society's expectation that empaths should be endlessly available for others' healing. But I need to give you Jung's final warning about this transformation. Once you begin protecting your light, you can't go back to unconscious empathy. Once you see the feeding patterns, you can't unsee them. Once you taste energetic sovereignty, you can't return to emotional slavery. This knowledge will cost you relationships. It will challenge your identity. It will force you to confront the parts of yourself that would rather be needed than respected, that would rather be useful than authentic, that would rather be depleted than alone. Some of you will use this information to justify building walls instead of boundaries. You'll become cynical about human connection rather than discerning about energetic exchange. You'll confuse emotional unavailability with spiritual strength. Don't make this mistake. The goal isn't to stop feeling or caring. The goal is to feel and care consciously, with intention and wisdom, rather than compulsion and unconsciousness. Jung's final warning was this: the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. But becoming who you truly are requires releasing who you think you should be for others' comfort. Your light is not a resource to be consumed. It's a presence to be embodied. Your empathy is not a service to be provided. It's a gift to be shared consciously. The world doesn't need more depleted healers. It needs awakened empaths who know the difference between love and enabling, between compassion and codependency, between service and self-sacrifice. If people started treating you differently when you stopped being their emotional dumping ground, comment, "They sensed my awakening before I announced it." Remember Jung's terrifying discovery about empaths being fed upon? The energy parasites he documented weren't monsters. They were unconscious beings who had learned to survive by consuming the light of others rather than kindling their own inner flame. Jung wrote in his final notes, "The greatest and most important problems of life are all fundamentally insoluble. They can never be solved, but only outgrown. You can't solve the problem of energy parasites by trying to heal them. You can only outgrow your need to be needed by them." But here's what Jung understood that changes everything. When you protect your light, you don't diminish it, you amplify it. When you stop letting others feed on your energy, you have more energy available for your own growth, your own healing, your own evolution. The empath who learns to guard their gifts doesn't become less compassionate. They become more discerning. They learn to offer their light to those who can receive it without depleting it, who can appreciate it without consuming it, who can match it without dimming it. Jung's final warning wasn't just about protecting yourself from energy parasites. It was about claiming your birthright as a conscious being who chooses how to use their gifts rather than being unconsciously driven to give them away. Your sensitivity is not a curse to be managed. It's a superpower to be mastered. Your empathy is not a weakness to be hidden. It's a strength to be wielded consciously. Your light is not fuel for others' darkness. It's illumination for your own path toward wholeness. The energy parasites Jung warned about can only feed on unconscious empaths. When you awaken to your true nature, when you learn to protect your essence while sharing your gifts, when you become sovereign over your own energy field, you become immune to their feeding mechanisms. That's the ultimate protection. Not walls that keep everyone out, but consciousness that lets only love in. Master this distinction, and you'll never again confuse being drained with being loved, being needed with being valued, or being depleted with being devoted. Jung's warning was clear. They're feeding on your light. But his promise was even clearer. You have the power to stop them. If you recognize yourself in this warning, you're not alone. Thousands of empaths are waking up to these patterns and reclaiming their power. Share in the comments. What's one boundary you're ready to set to protect your light? Your story might be exactly what another empath needs to hear to begin their own journey toward energetic sovereignty. If you're ready to dive deeper into Jung's psychology and how it applies to modern relationships, check out my video on Why You Have No Motivation, Left After Facing Your Shadow, Carl Jung's Psychology, where I reveal what happens to your drive and ambition when you begin the shadow integration process. Thank you for watching. See you in the next dimension.